Hey everyone, and welcome back to the deep dive.
Yeah.
So lately it feels like all you hear about is populism this, globalism that, right?
Right.
It's like everyone's picking a side.
Yeah.
But we got this article from one of you listeners, and it's about how populist governments actually act, like what they do when it comes to international organizations. And let me tell you, it is way more interesting than just saying, oh, populists take globalism, end of story.
It really is. Yeah. The article's called Beyond Exit, How Populist Governments Disengage from International Institutions. And it really flips the script on that whole, simple story.
Totally.
And it was published just this year, so hot off the presses, by Agnieszka Paciardi, Kilian Spandler, and Frederick Soderbaum. They're all political scientists, so they've really dug into this. And they don't just talk about ideas, they actually looked at specific leaders, like Viktor Orban, he's the prime minister of Hungary.
Right.
And of course, Donald Trump during his presidency in the U.S.
Makes sense. Those are some pretty big names when it comes to populism, right?
Absolutely.
But they didn't just stop there. They also looked at how these leaders dealt with groups like, the EU, NATO, the UN, even NAFTA.
Yeah, a whole mix.
These are the big players we hear about all the time in the news, right?
Every day.
So where do we even begin with all this?
Well, they start by tackling this idea that's kind of common, that populists basically just want to burn the whole system down.
Okay, yeah.
They call it the disengagement hypothesis. But here's the thing. They found that while populists definitely challenge the system, they don't actually fully withdraw from these international groups most of the time.
So it's more complicated than just like they hate these groups and they want out. So what's the deal then?
Well, instead of just packing up and leaving, the authors found that these governments use all these different tactics. Some are low-key, some not so much. They have this great phrase for it. They call it a repertoire of disengagement.
Okay, I kind of love that.
Right. It's like they've got this whole toolkit.
Yeah.
And depending on what they're trying to accomplish, they might use a screwdriver or they might pull out a sledgehammer.
Okay, now I'm really interested. So let's break down this toolkit, all right? What are some of the tactics they use?
So they found four main categories. First up is criticism. That one's pretty straightforward, publicly calling these institutions out, saying they're ineffective. Like, remember when Trump called NATO obsolete?
Oh, yeah, classic.
Yeah, everyone and their grandmother heard about that one, right?
Sure.
That's a perfect example of criticism in action. But here's where it gets even more interesting, that criticism, it's not always just talk. A lot of times it's paired with what they call extortion.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, so that's where they use threats, like saying they'll withhold funding or cooperation unless they get their way.
The good old or else strategy.
Exactly.
And it's not always empty threats either, right?
Oh, definitely not. Think about when the Trump administration, they actually cut funding to UN agencies.
Right.
Or when Orban used his veto power to stall things in the EU, they weren't afraid to flex their muscles a little.
Wow, so it's like they're not just talking, they're willing to throw their weight around a little bit, but they didn't always go for the nuclear option.
Right.
Like completely pulling out.
You're right. Even when they went beyond just words, they rarely completely bailed on these organizations. And that's where the third tactic comes in strategic obstruction. Like, imagine throwing sand in the gears,
Right.
They want to disrupt things, slow things down, but not necessarily break them completely.
I gotcha.
It's calculated chaos, you could say.
Okay, so we've got criticism, we've got extortion, strategic obstruction. I'm going to guess that last tactic is the big one, right?
You got it. That final and most extreme tactic is exit, actually leaving the organization.
Okay, the classic mic drop.
Right, and the article points out this did happen,
Okay,
but it was actually pretty rare.
interesting.
And they usually only did it with groups where leaving wasn't going to cost them too much.
So it's all about minimizing the damage.
Exactly.
So like when the U.S. left UNESCO or the Human Rights Council while Trump was in office.
Exactly. Those are the big headlines.
They were.
But it's important to remember, they didn't just leave everything.
Right. Okay, so we have these four tactics, but like, what does it all mean? Why all this back and forth? Why not just like make a clean break if you're not happy?
Yeah, it's like pick a lane, right?
Yeah.
Well, the authors of this article, they say it comes down to what populism really is. At its core, it's this balancing act. They have to play the part of the outsider, the one who's going to shake things up.
Yeah.
But they also have to, govern.
Right, they have a country to run.
Exactly. They actually use this phrase, navigating the ambivalent foreign policy imperatives engendered by the populist master frame. But basically what it means is they have to keep their base happy, the people who voted for them, by standing up to what they see as the elites, which often includes these international organizations. But they also need to be pragmatic to get things done.
It's a tightrope walk for sure.
Totally.
So they have to choose their moments, right? Like when to make a big scene and when to play it a little more strategically.
That's exactly it. Sometimes it's about making a big, loud statement, but other times it's about being more strategic, picking their battles. And one really important point the article makes is that this isn't just some abstract idea. It played out in really different ways, depending on the country, the organization, even the specific issue at hand. Like, they have this great line where they describe Orban's approach to the EU as a peacock dance, which I just love.
Okay, now that is an image. Tell me more about this peacock dance. I have to know.
So you've got this peacock, right, strutting around, all big and flashy.
Showing off.
Trying to intimidate the competition.
Okay.
That's Orban with the EU, but like with this extra layer of strategy underneath.
So it's about looking tough, but not actually flying the coop.
Exactly.
Okay, but what does that look like in the real world? Like, give me an example.
Okay, so take Hungary's Stop Brussels campaign, right?
Yeah.
It was all about painting the EU as this big bureaucratic monster that was out to like crush Hungarian sovereignty, especially in immigration. That was a big one.
Oh, for sure. Orban was really hammering that point home.
Oh, yeah.
Like, they're sending us migrants. But he didn't just complain about it, did he?
No way. He actually put policies in place that were directly aimed at, like, throwing a wrench in the EU's migration policies.
Right.
And he even held a referendum on it. You know, the people versus Brussels.
Oh, classic populist move.
Total classic.
Talk about playing to your base, right?
Totally.
But I'm guessing the EU wasn't exactly thrilled with all of this, right?
Yeah, not exactly their favorite jam.
So what happened?
So it's like this pattern kept popping up, you know? The criticism, the maneuvering, the strategic obstruction. You see it again with LGBTQ rights, for example.
Right.
Orban went head-to-head with the EU over Hungary's policies there.
Yeah, that was big news.
Pushing the limits, testing the waters, you know.
Always pushing those boundaries. So lots of saber rattling, but at the end of the day, he never actually left the EU.
Nope.
Which makes you wonder, why stay in a club that you seem to hate so much?
It's like, imagine Thanksgiving dinner with your family, right? You've got those relatives, everybody's got them, who complain about everything.
Oh, yeah.
But they always show up.
Always.
For the free food, for the drama, you know?
Okay, I can get behind that analogy for sure.
Yeah.
So you're saying Orban, he was in it for the perks, even though he liked to stir the pot.
Exactly. He knew that being part of the EU came with some pretty sweet benefits.
Yeah, like what?
Well, financially, for one.
Right, like all those EU funds that go to the member states.
Exactly. Remember when the EU tried to, like, link those funds to Hungary, improving its record on things like the rule of law and democratic reforms?
Oh, yeah, that did not go over well.
Orban basically said, well, fine, if that's how you want to play it, I'm just going to veto the entire budget.
Wow.
He knew he had leverage, and he wasn't afraid to use it.
Classic extortion.
Classic.
And didn't he pull a similar move when it came to sanctions against Russia?
Yes.
Like dragging his feet to get what he wanted from the other EU members? It's kind of amazing how much power one country can have if they know how to play the game, you know?
Oh, absolutely. It shows that for Orban, this wasn't just about burning bridges, it was about strategy.
Right.
And speaking of strategy, Orban's approach to NATO, that takes this whole peacock dance idea to a whole other level.
Okay, now this I got to hear, because NATO seems like a much tougher crowd to pull that off with, right?
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But it's the same pattern.
Yeah.
The criticism, the obstruction.
Wow.
But the stakes are way higher, especially with everything going on in Europe security-wise.
And this was before Russia invaded Ukraine, right?
Right. So Orban had been a critic of NATO for a while.
Okay.
But his rhetoric after the invasion, next level.
How so?
He was publicly against the sanctions on Russia and really hesitant to fully back Ukraine. Put him at odds with a lot of other NATO members.
Sounds like he was walking a very, very fine line.
Oh, totally. And then there's the whole Sweden joining NATO saga.
Oh, man. Don't even get me started.
All right.
Talk about stalling tactics. What was that all about?
Pure obstruction.
Really?
He used Hungary's vote to delay Sweden's membership, and while he eventually caved, you couldn't help but notice it happened after he got some concessions from other NATO members.
It's like he was saying, you want my help? It's going to cost you.
Right. And again, you see that tension, that push and pull between the populist rhetoric and then his very strategic use of power within these organizations. He challenges, he disrupts, but he also knows how to work the system to his advantage.
So it seems like his whole strategy wasn't about actually leaving these groups, but more about getting them to do things his way.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
They're like, I'm not going to leave, but I'm going to make you sorry you asked me to join.
Right.
But, it's not just him.
Mhm.
We saw echoes of this with Trump and how he approached the UN, right?
Oh, totally.
I mean, if anyone knew how to make a scene on the world stage, it was Trump.
Absolutely.
From day one, he let everyone know he wasn't afraid to shake things up at the UN.
Oh, yeah. He definitely wasn't afraid of a little drama.
Like, remember when he called it and I quote, cesspool of political bias?
Oh,
Classic Trump.
dramatic.
But it wasn't just talk either. He actually pulled the U.S. out of UNESCO, the Human Rights Council.
Big moves.
Huge.
Yeah, and those were just the tip of the iceberg, too.
Right. Didn't he also cut funding to a bunch of different UN agencies and even threaten to pull out of UN peacekeeping altogether?
He did all of that. And remember, the U.S. was and still is a major player in the UN.
Huge financial contributor.
Exactly. And Trump wasn't afraid to use that to try and force some changes.
So a much more, shall we say, aggressive approach than Orban.
I'd say so. Yeah.
Orban was working with a smaller hand, for sure. But they both play their cards pretty strategically, trying to reshape things from the inside.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, did it work?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Right.
Did all that drama actually lead to any real change? That is the million-dollar question. Did all this, populist peacocking, did it actually make a difference?
It's tough to say for sure. It's complicated, On the one hand, you could argue that shaking things up the way they did, it forced these institutions to, confront some uncomfortable truths about themselves.
So like a wake-up call, hey, we're not just going to sit here and take it anymore.
Exactly. Take the UN, for example. They've been talking about reforming, forever.
Yeah, for decades.
But sometimes it takes a real push, and maybe even a threat to get them to actually make a change.
So maybe these populist leaders, with all their dramatic exits and veto threats and everything, maybe they're actually pushing these global groups in the right direction in a weird way.
It's possible, right? But there's a really fine line between offering constructive criticism and just, blowing the whole thing up.
Right, right. And how do you even know where that line is? How can you tell if they're genuinely trying to make things better or if they're just out to cause chaos?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's where it gets really dangerous, because if countries start to think they can just ignore the rules or, throw a tantrum every time they don't get their way,
right,
the whole system starts to fall apart.
Yeah, it's like a team project, If one person's not pulling their weight or they keep trying to change the rules, the whole project suffers. And in this case, the project is, global stability.
Exactly. And the stakes are huge. We're talking about war and peace, the global economy, climate change. These institutions, even with all their problems, they're supposed to help us deal with these big challenges together.
So what can we do? Regular people, how do we make sure these institutions are strong enough to withstand these kinds of, populist power plays?
Well, I think awareness is a big part of it. We have to understand these tactics, the criticism, the extortion, the obstruction, even those exits. We need to be able to spot them when they're happening and call them out.
So don't be fooled by the big speeches and the headlines, right?
Yeah.
There's always a strategy at play.
Always. And beyond that, I think we have to actively support these institutions. Advocate for reform, hold our own leaders accountable for how they're acting within these groups.
Just stay informed, basically, right?
Yeah.
Knowledge is power and all that.
Exactly. The more we understand about how these organizations actually work, the more we can do to protect them and make sure they're working for everyone, not just a select few.
I love that. This has been such an insightful conversation, really eye-opening. So for you, our listener, the next time you see a headline about a populist leader clashing with some global organization, just remember, there's more to the story than meets the eye. Think back to those 4 tactics. Criticism, extortion, obstruction, and exit. Are they trying to burn the whole system down, or are they just trying to remodel it to fit their own agenda?
Asking those questions, that's the first step. And once you understand these tactics, once you can see the strategy behind the headlines, it really helps you navigate this crazy world,
It's all about connecting those dots. And that's what the deep dive is here for, to give you the knowledge and the context you need to see the bigger picture. So, until next time, stay curious and keep asking those questions.
Because the more you know, the more sense you can make of it all.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We'll see you on the next deep dive.